r/ask Reddit. What piece of history is too crazy to believe, yet is still true? The marathon in the 1904 Olympics. First finisher hitched a ride in a car. He was disqualified. Second finisher was carried across the finish line by his trainers, who had been giving him a mixture of brandy and rat poison throughout the race. He almost died, but the doping wasn't illegal yet, and so he got the gold. Third finisher had taken a nap, because he ate some rotten apples he found by the road. Fifth finisher had been chased for a mile in the wrong direction by wild dogs. Several entrants had never run a race before, and there was a South African delegation of runners who weren't even part of the Olympics. They were just students who were in town who wanted to take part. Also, there was a Cuban mailman who tried to go for the prize money to afford a ticket back home. Seriously, why isn't this a movie yet? So basically an Olympic version of Rat Race, or it's a mad world. I can get behind that movie idea. Best part. South Africans ran barefoot. One was chased by a dog, and they both placed highly at 9th and 12th. I'm more impressed by the guy who took a nap and still managed to finish third. The son of one of my old teachers runs ultra marathons and is so good that during one he felt sick and stopped at a health station to nap for an hour, and then went on to win by over 3 hours against his nearest competition. Guy's nuts. In the early mid-5th century, in the Eastern Roman Empire, near modern-day Aleppo, there was a Christian monk named Simeon the Stylite who spent 40 years of his life living atop a 60-foot tall pillar. He just stayed up there all day and all night. He had fellow monks bring him food, drink, etc. to stay alive. According to the 3 surviving biographies which were written during or shortly after his lifetime, by people who knew him, he literally spent 40 years on this pillar without coming down once. He would preach to crowds below, pray to God, and help mediate legal disputes. He wrote to both the Roman Emperor and the Persian King of Kings, advising both on spiritual matters. People came to visit him from as far away as Gaul, modern-day France, and Britain. No small accomplishment in the 5th century. Dude got so famous for just chilling on top of a pillar for 40 years straight that over 1,500 years later we have 3 biographies of him and I'm writing about him on the internet. Seriously, how do you poop and pee from on top of the pillar for 40 years? Some dudes will need to shovel all the craps away from the pillar bottom every day. The pillar was kind of cone shaped, including the surrounding dirt. After 40 years, an army was sent to capture Napoleon and he persuaded them and took command of it. Imgane being the one in Paris to have to relay that message along. Speech 100. An illiterate teenage peasant girl heard voices of saints and archangels telling her to kick the English out of France. So she did it. To be fair, a lot of the French leadership thought she was batshit crazy and were afraid of her popularity. They didn't like a woman involved in military matters, and she often had to dress like a man, which was illegal at the time, in order to pass. Eventually the French imprisoned her and gave her to the English, who tried her for heresy and cross-dressing, then executed her. The French helped the English kill her. The current Swedish royal family is descended from a man named Bernadotte, who was invited to take the throne by Swedish aristocrats. Bernadotte was one of Napoleon's marshals, having worked his way up from private, but his sole qualification for becoming king was that he had met some Swedes once, and been nice to them. The moral of this story: always be cool to foreigners, because you never know when they are going to want somebody to run their country. He also had a tattoo that said "Death to Kings." No one was allowed to see his naked body until after he died. He was so embarrassed by it. He also attacked Napoleon later on because he told him that his allegiance was no longer to him but to the people of Sweden. Napoleon was quite furious. Pope Saint Leo met alone with the Hunnic armies just about to sack Rome. Nobody knows what he said to Attila, but it made him take his massive army and turn it around, leaving the Roman Empire for the time being, saving Rome and its inhabitants from God knows what. He rolled a natural 20. It's not surprising. Gods always do. In reality, the Huns had just sacked and completely demolished Aquileia, so they had tons of gold and were probably paid off with a little more. Also, they most likely were dealing with famine since they didn't have great supply lines like the Romans did. Not that he isn't brave for confronting Attila, but in reality it was more likely that external factors led to the Huns' retreat opposed to some divine intervention and words from a pope. As I understand things, the Horde would often give people the option of paying them off instead of taking the sacking. The personal accounts of the First World War. Out in no man's land, the sun swelled up the dead with gas and often turned them blue, almost navy blue. Then, when the gas escaped, the bodies dried up like mummies and were frozen in their death positions. Sitting bodies, kneeling bodies, bodies in almost every position, though most lay on their bellies or on their backs. The crows pecked out the eyes and rats lived on bodies that lay in abandoned dugouts. These rats were very large and quite fearless, their familiarity with the dead having made them contemptuous of the living. One night one fell on my face in a dugout and bit me. Where we fought several times over the same ground, bodies became incorporated in the material of the trenches themselves. They were putrid, with the consistency of camembert cheese. I once fell and put my hand right through the belly of a man. It was days before I got the smell out of my nails. The accounts are insane. Here is another story for your interest. The Battle of Passchendaele was known for its mud. In a record instance, as a troop of soldiers were approaching the front, one of their members fell off the boards they were walking on and into the mud. He sank to his thighs and couldn't free himself. His comrades threw him a rope which he secured under his armpits. However, despite their best efforts, the comrades were unable to free the man in the mud. Although the man was less than 5 feet from the safety of the board and holding a rope, no effort could free him. Eventually an officer forces the stuck man's comrades to move onto the front. After their rotation on the front, 4 days, the same troop retreated along the same path. Returning, they passed the stuck man who was still alive. He had been driven mad by exposure, raving as they passed, and had sunk up to his neck. The soldiers kept moving, leaving him to die. Listen to Dan Carlin's Hardcore History podcast Blueprints of Armageddon if you wish to learn more about World War I. Damn, why not just put him out of his misery? Eventually they started doing that with the soldiers who became trapped in the mud. Passchendaele was one of the most horrific battles of the most horrific war in history. The Dancing Plague. It's so ridiculously hilarious. People danced for days. I think it lasted over a month, and eventually died of heart attacks, exhaustion, or strokes. They just couldn't stop. Holy shit, this is real. It seems like a bunch of people ate acid for the first time and had an impromptu music festival. The leading theory is actually ergot, a fungus that can cause hallucinations and erratic behavior, that infested the wheat harvest. Interestingly enough, certain kinds of ergot are the source of a chemical used to make LSD. One of the greatest natural disasters in human history was the flu between 1918 and 1920.500 million contacted it, and 100 million, 5% of the world population, died. This came right after 20 million people had died in World War I. Technically it happened during it, but due to the media blackout in the countries at war, it wasn't reported or made known to the world's media for fear it would be picked up by the enemy. Spain was a non-combatant country and thus there was no media blackout, hence the term Spanish flu. We went to the ducking moon and came back. Then we went back up with a car and did donuts on the ducking moon. And played golf on the moon. A British Army officer fought World War II armed with a longbow, bagpipes and a sword and actually killed a German staff sergeant with an arrow. Mad Jack Churchill. Not quite as butch, but equally eccentric is Digby Tatton Water. He trained his men to use bugle calls in case their radios were disabled, and they eventually were. He also carried an umbrella into battle, because he had trouble remembering passwords, and felt that anyone who saw him with it would think that only a bloody fool of an Englishman would carry an umbrella into battle. He later used that umbrella to disable an armored car by sticking it through the observation slit and poking the driver in the eye. Another eccentric World War II character, Joe Medicine Crow. His service in the war qualified him as the last war chief of the Crow Nation. He completed all 4 tasks required to become a war chief: touching an enemy without killing him, counting coup, taking an enemy's weapon, leading a successful war party, and stealing an enemy's horse. On a related matter, Lieutenant Colonel A.D. Wintle, among other things, he signed his own arrest warrant for attempting to steal a plane when it was found that he was the highest ranked soldier present at the time, commanded a dying soldier to recover from his terminal illnesses, which he actually did, and lived to 95, and, after being imprisoned in a French garrison, he inspired all 280 men present there to join the French resistance after his transfer by means of insulting their slovenly appearance and demanding that they carry themselves like actual soldiers. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014, and the world did almost nothing about it. Our thoughts and prayers are with the Ukrainians. The Great Emu War gets me every time. Like, as if it weren't embarrassing enough that there was a Great Emu War, we lost. When nuclear power was conceived and reactors were built, they did all of the math without calculators and computers, used slide rules. How many of us crutch on that handy phone calculator every day? I know I do. That 2 bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki instantly killed 70 to 80,000 people in the blink of an eye. And they were the lucky ones. The stories I've read of people that were too far away from the blast to die instantly but close enough to have their faces melted are horrible. It really does hit home the whole NK situation and what could happen if they were to launch an actual nuclear attack. Then there's always that story of the guy who was in Nagasaki when it got bombed, then transported to Hiroshima for medical treatment and got bombed again. Who was that Chinese leader who didn't have a big enough army to repel invaders, so he just left the gates wide open? The invaders were so convinced that he was confident because he had a huge army and they left. If you're talking about Zhuge Liang Sima Yi, it's actually a bit more complicated than that. Zhuge Liang was a brilliant, sneaky ass bastard that had a reputation for ambushing the shit out of his opponents and using the environment to his advantage, thus destroying large armies with a small number of men. Seriously, read up on him. Dude did some insane shit. Sima Yi was his rival, and was a cautious man, with his speciality being unraveling his opponent's plans before they began. Since Sima Yi tended to have more men and resources, he started winning battles against the former once he started really coming into his own. Because let's be real, more men is pretty much a guarantee to win like 95% of the time. So Zhuge Liang has to protect this city with next to no army, like less than 1,000 people. Literally, if he fights any kind of battle here, he will lose. His only option for survival is not to fight, and that's looking more and more impossible until he hears that his rival is leading the opposing army, and then he gets this brilliant idea. He basically opens all the gates, sends his men out in civilian clothes to sweep the streets so there are no visible soldiers anywhere, and sits on top of the gate drinking tea and chilling out and basically makes the whole thing out to be a trap. When Sima Yi comes, he's waiting and basically welcomes him with open arms. Sima Yi is lucky he's never been that obvious about his traps before. This is definitely a bluff and we can win this ASAP, and he's about to head in when it hits him. Zhuge Liang knows that Sima Yi thinks he's bluffing. He gets it in his head that maybe, just maybe, Zhuge Liang has this cunning plan that will wipe out his army. Recall that he has a pretty good handle on what his rival is capable of, and that was ducking people's shit up when they least expect it. So after a long period of deliberation, which is basically him explaining to his generals he knows that I know that he knows that, Sima Yi eventually decides to turn his entire army around and leave. Zhuge Liang later pointed out that the plan was based specifically on the fact that he was facing his rival. If it had been anyone else, there's no way it would have worked. A dumber or less cautious person would have simply charged in and won without breaking a sweat. Sima Yi was too smart and it cost him. And that's the real genius here. It was a plan formed entirely just to deceive one man. And it worked. The technology difference in the short time between World War I and II. Hell, the technology difference between the start and end of World War II alone. Several air forces started World War II with biplanes still in service and ended the war with jet aircraft. Shortly after the American Civil War, a group of Irish Americans calling themselves the Fenian Brotherhood banded together, sold war bonds, and attempted to invade and hold Canada hostage in an attempt to get Britain to release Ireland. There were 5 major raids. Of those raids, the Fenians actually won 2 battles and briefly held Canadian territory. After the first raid, The United States Navy cut off their supply lines and the Fenians were forced to retreat back to the US. The second raid was a comedy of errors perpetrated by the Canadian militia and British Army. Essentially, the Queen's Own Rifles, who were a ragtag militia at the time, met the Fenian Brotherhood's army and exchanged fire for a brief period. Not long after, the British Army arrives. The Queen's Own Rifles retire from the field to give room for the British regulars. Mistaking this as a general retreat, the British Army also retires the field. The rest of the raids essentially follow a pattern of the Fenians exchanging useless fire with the Canadians British, then going home. The last raid is perhaps the funniest. While other invasions had hundreds to even over 1,000 men, the last had approximately 30. Their plan was to go into central Canada via the Dakota Territory. They attack a Hudson trading post and, shortly after, are arrested by the US authorities. This attack never actually made it to Canada as surveyors found that the trading post was actually in what is now Minnesota. Most of the Fenian soldiers suffered no consequences for essentially spending several years invading Canada. Solely basing this on Irish pride and Netflix, with some short reading after. 157 Irish peacekeepers based in the Congo held off 3,000 attackers, killing over 300 of them, sustaining no losses themselves and a few injuries. Received no support from the UN and eventually surrendered when they used every bullet twice. Quite literally, they made a shrapnel bomb with the empty shells. It was the first time an official army from Ireland faced combat. The Irish government swept it under the rug, pretended it didn't happen due to the surrender, which they considered a disgrace. I was amazed by that film. Read quite a bit about the conflict after I watched it. Be proud of your countrymen. OHH. I used to post on Facebook for a music school and came across this gem. Around the time of the great classical writers, a common yet interesting thing was that composers would challenge each other to 1v1s. Music duels. Mostly improvisation duels. Beethoven one day was challenged by a composer named Stabelt. The cocky young composer challenged him and went first. Stabelt threw his own composition on the ground and played perfectly, met with rousing applause. Beethoven, however, stood up, took the piece that Stabelt threw to the ground and showed it to the audience. Nobles loved watching the shit. He took it and turned it upside down. He sat down and played it perfectly. He then took the theme of the composition and improvised on it for over an hour. Stabelt left halfway through but promised to never return to Vienna as long as Beethoven lived there. Beethoven lived in Vienna until he died. So Beethoven was to classical music duels as Eminem is to rap battles? American government did mind control experiments. Your use of the past tense is adorable. The only reason the Union was warned about the Battle of Antietam was that some dumbass officer dropped his orders while they were wrapped in cigars. Harry Turtledove wrote an 11-book series imagining what might have happened had they not lost those orders. The Confederacy wins the War of Secession and establishes themselves as an independent nation. The series then follows history until the end of World War II, with the USA and CSA on opposite sides in both world wars. Australia introduced cane toads to eliminate cane beetles, but turns out they had no interest in eating the cane beetles, so they had two problems on their hands. My dad told me of a story of a town of fishermen who were catching too many starfish. Solution? Catch a starfish, chop it in half. Of course, starfish can regrow their entire body, so now they had twice the problem. How difficult it was for the conspirators to kill Rasputin. Johnny Cash was the first person in the Western world to hear of the death of Joseph Stalin. While stationed at Landsberg in West Germany, it was his job to intercept Soviet Morse code communications. On the 5th of March 1953, Johnny intercepted the communication that told of the death of one of history's most important men. Johnny Cash was obliged to keep this secret for many years, but it was revealed in his autobiography, Cash by Johnny Cash. Hiro Onoda, a soldier in the Japanese army during World War II who fought in the war for 30 years after it ended. He was told to never surrender himself or commit suicide under any circumstances. When he was fighting in the jungles, he and his squad were told that the war was over. He thought that this was the Allies trying to get him to surrender. He continued to raid villages, which he thought were enemy bases, for the next 30 years. Another unbelievable story is the one of Yang Kung-jong. He was a Korean man who was forced to fight in the Japanese Imperial Army in World War II. During the war, he was captured by Russia and forced to fight in the Russian Red Army. While fighting for Russia, he was captured by the German Wehrmacht and forced to fight for them as well. As far as I know, he was the only person in the Second World War to fight for 3 different armies. Yang Kyung-jong was then taken prisoner by Americans on the beaches of Normandy. That someone created a bronze bull statue that had a firelight underneath it. To the unsuspecting people around it, they would hear what would sound like the sounds of a bull, but inside was a person who was being roasted alive. What gets me is that they were able to engineer the acoustics of the person's screams to sound like the bull sounds. It's called the Brazen Bull. They put the creator behind it inside it first. LOL. Was about to comment this. Pretty sure the creator who presented it was the first to be thrown into it. He made a mistake. The Second Crusade ended when the Queen of France banged her uncle. Damn Targaryens. One of the bloodiest wars of all time, often tallied as the second most, ahead of World War I, depending on the parameters, was caused by a Chinese guy claiming to be Jesus' younger brother and leading a revolution along the Yangtze River in China. The 30 Years' War, a war that devastated Europe and led to the demise of the Holy Roman Empire, arguably the biggest and most powerful empire in Europe, was started by some guys pushing government officials out of windows into horse manure. The event even has its own name, the Defenestration of Prague. I love that there have been multiple times in history where a religious war started because someone got thrown out of a window in Prague. Probably some of the shit that various Roman emperors got up to just because they could. Caligula made a whole bunch of boats line up over the Bay of Baiae so he could use them as a bridge to defy a prophecy. Nero had his mother killed and kicked his pregnant wife to death. Domitian openly wanted the people to call him a god, which was absolute heresy to Romans. And that's just a tiny fragment of what a few emperors did. The fall of the Berlin Wall basically started because of a clerical error to let some people out for a short visit, but ended up being received as everyone can get out now. The Habsburg family tree. Seriously guys, spread out the gene pool. Teddy Roosevelt got shot in the chest while campaigning for the 1912 election and finished his speech while a ducking bullet was lodged in him. More French soldiers died in World War I than Americans in any American war combined, including both sides of the Civil War. People thought the bodies of Catholic saints didn't decay. For example, Saint Cecilia died in 177 AD, and she looks very much the same as she did at her time of death. To put it clearly, if a corpse was found to be extremely well preserved, the person was considered to be incorruptible, which was considered a qualifying miraculous event to put them on a path to sainthood. Most of the incorruptible saints on display are treated heavily with wax to preserve them, even as they decayed after their initial discovery. That the CIA attempted to take out Castro by lacing his cigarettes with poison that would first make him bald, then said baldness would cause unpopularity, then a coup, and then all of the other attempts at killing him that were an epic fail. The reinforcements sent to Hernan Cortes which allowed him to succeed in the conquest of Mexico were actually sent to bring him to justice. He'd stolen the ships and the expedition in the first place. You see, after he attacked them and knocked out their leader's eye, he convinced the rest of the men to join him instead. Though poorly documented and deemed local folklore instead of formal history, the monkey hanging was a trial that was held in Hartlepool, a North English town, sometime during the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century, after a French vessel crashed and sank off the northern coast of GB. The only survivor was a pet monkey that was kept on the ship for entertainment. The monkey was even given a French uniform as a joke supposedly. Upon this pet monkey washing ashore, the locals were dumbfounded, never having seen either a Frenchman or a monkey before in their lives. Based off the uniform, they thought the monkey must have been a French spy, and when it refused to answer questioning, because it was a goddamn monkey, they deemed it guilty and executed it via hanging right there on the beach. The monkey hanger is now a popular insult for people from Hartlepool. And that monkey had a very bad day. Whoa, you made it to the end? You're a ducking beast. I'll cut you a deal. Smash like and subscribe for more curated content, bruh. It's free and that's a great price.